Have you ever known someone who stays silent during conflicts, but still expects others to understand exactly how they feel? This quiet behavior might seem humble, but it can be a form of passive egoism. In today's episode of Ego Pedia, we'll dive into how ego doesn't always appear loud or aggressive. Sometimes it hides in silence and unspoken expectations, and in the hope that others will read between the lines. Let's explore how this subtle ego can quietly shape and strain our relationships.
The silent language of the ego. Not all forms of egoism are loud, boastful, or domineering. Some wear the mask of silence, quiet, mysterious, and often misunderstood. This is passive egoism. It's when someone avoids expressing their thoughts clearly, yet still expects others to understand, support, or even validate them. At first glance, this may seem like humility or emotional reserve. But over time, it can become an emotional trap for both the individual and those around them. 1. What is passive egoism? Expanded, passive egoism is a subtle and often misunderstood form of ego expression. Unlike overt egoism, which tends to manifest through bragging, dominating conversations, or aggressively asserting one's needs, passive egoism hides in silence, ambiguity, and indirect behavior. It's not about shouting, "Look at me," but rather whispering, "Why isn't anyone seeing me without me having to say anything?" At its core, passive egoism is rooted in unspoken expectations. The individual may rarely express their thoughts, feelings, or desires clearly. Yet, they hold a strong internal belief that others should naturally understand what they're going through. They might think, if they really cared, they'd know. This assumption becomes the foundation for their emotional reality. Some common expressions of passive egoism include avoiding direct requests, but feeling upset when those needs aren't met, refusing to explain hurt feelings while expecting apologies or emotional reassurance, believing that vulnerability is a weakness, but still expecting deep emotional validation. What makes passive egoism tricky is that it disguises itself as humility or emotional restraint. On the surface, these individuals seem composed, non-confrontational, even self-sacrificing. But underneath, there's a desire to be recognized, appreciated, or understood, without the effort of openly expressing that desire. This internal conflict between invisibility and recognition often leads to dissatisfaction in relationships, both personal and professional. For example, in a friendship, a passive egoist might do a lot for the other person, offer help, give gifts, listen to problems, but when the favor isn't returned or the same energy isn't reciprocated, they feel deeply hurt. Not because they were rejected, but because they expected unspoken loyalty or appreciation without ever voicing those needs. The thought is, after everything I've done, how could you not see how I feel? This behavior is not inherently manipulative or malicious. Often, it stems from a fear of rejection, a lack of self-worth, or a deep-rooted discomfort with emotional transparency. But regardless of the intention, the outcome is the same. Relationships become strained by a constant guessing game, and the passive egoist remains in a cycle of emotional disappointment. To summarize, passive egoism is not about silence itself, but the ego-driven expectation behind that silence. It's the hope to be understood without ever risking honesty. It's the desire to be seen without ever stepping into the light. And that contradiction is what makes it one of the most emotionally confusing forms of egoism to identify and confront. 2. The emotional cost on others expanded. When someone lives with passive egoism, they may believe that their silence is harmless, or even noble. But the truth is, their silence speaks volumes, and others are the ones forced to interpret it. Over time, the emotional toll this creates on the people around them can be heavy and, in some cases, deeply damaging. Imagine being in a relationship, romantic, familial, or professional, with someone who rarely expresses what they want, yet often feels disappointed or hurt when their needs aren't met. This creates a dynamic of constant emotional guesswork. You're left wondering, did I do something wrong? Why are they upset? Should I have known what they wanted? Am I being selfish for not sensing their mood? This guessing game becomes emotionally exhausting. The person interacting with the passive egoist begins to carry the weight of both sides of the relationship, managing their own emotions while trying to navigate the unspoken frustrations of the other. It's like playing a game with invisible rules that constantly change. Over time, this dynamic leads to several negative outcomes. 1. Emotional fatigue. Having to constantly decode someone's silence is tiring. It's not just about picking up on subtle cues, it's about dealing with the pressure of being wrong, even when there was no clear communication. People start to feel like they're being set up to fail emotionally. They walk away from conversations feeling confused, blamed, or emotionally drained, even when nothing was directly said. 2. Anxiety and self-doubt. Being close to a passive egoist often makes others question their own emotional competence. They may start doubting their ability to be a good friend, partner, or coworker. Why can't I make them happy? What am I missing? This constant self-questioning erodes confidence and creates a sense of never being enough in the relationship. 3. Resentment. At first, people may be patient and understanding. But when they realize that no matter how hard they try, they can never meet the unspoken expectations, resentment starts to build. They may feel manipulated or emotionally cornered. They may think, why do I always have to figure things out? Why can't they just say what they need? This resentment grows silently, just like the passive egoism itself, and can eventually lead to emotional withdrawal or even the breakdown of the relationship. 4. Breakdown of trust. When communication is unclear, trust suffers. If someone withholds their true feelings but still expects others to act accordingly, it creates an emotional imbalance. The other person begins to feel like they're being judged without a chance to defend themselves. Trust isn't just about honesty, it's also about openness. Without it, the bond becomes fragile. 5. Imbalance of responsibility. In many cases, the person interacting with a passive egoist ends up doing all the emotional labor. They initiate the hard conversations. They try to repair misunderstandings. They manage both sets of emotions. This creates a dynamic where one person is emotionally overfunctioning while the other is underfunctioning, intentionally or not. And over time, that imbalance becomes unsustainable. The silent emotional weight. What's most important to understand is that passive egoism is not just an internal issue. It affects everyone around the person. The silence they maintain becomes an emotional noise others must constantly tune into and decode. It's a burden disguised as stillness. And while the passive egoist may feel like they are simply quiet or deep, they often fail to recognize the emotional chaos their unspoken expectations create. In summary, the emotional cost of passive egoism is paid not only by the person who holds it, but also by the people who love them, work with them, or care for them. It's a cost measured not in words, but in stress, confusion, and emotional exhaustion. 3. Why passive egoism develops. Expanded. Passive egoism doesn't appear out of nowhere. It's often the result of complex emotional experiences, unconscious defense mechanisms, and long-standing psychological conditioning. While it may look like a personality trait, in many cases, passive egoism is a learned emotional survival strategy, one that once served a purpose, but now creates hidden barriers in relationships. Let's explore the deeper psychological roots that can give rise to passive egoism. 1. Fear of vulnerability and rejection. At the core of passive egoism is often a deep fear of being vulnerable. Expressing one's needs out loud means risking rejection, misunderstanding, or judgment. For some, that risk is too painful to bear. So instead, they say nothing but hope everything. By staying silent, they avoid the discomfort of being told no, or being seen as needy or weak. However, they still expect others to understand and meet their emotional needs, even without being asked. This creates a paradox. They want connection, but they're unwilling to expose the very truths that could foster it. 2. Childhood conditioning. Passive egoism often begins in early childhood. Many people grow up in environments where expressing needs was discouraged, ignored, or punished. Maybe they had emotionally unavailable parents. Maybe they were taught that good children are quiet and undemanding. Or maybe they were praised when they didn't speak up and scolded when they did. Over time, These children learn that speaking out doesn't lead to fulfillment. It leads to pain, shame, or dismissal. As adults, they carry that silence with them, not realizing that they're still operating under old rules from a time when silence was safer than honesty. 3. Low self-worth hidden behind ego. Interestingly, passive egoism can also mask low self-esteem. The person may feel they're not worthy of asking directly for what they want, but their ego still longs for recognition. So they suppress the voice of self-advocacy, but secretly hope someone else will validate them without being asked. This creates a subtle form of emotional entitlement. If I stay quiet and selfless, someone should notice and reward me. But the reward doesn't come, not because people don't care, but because they were never told what was needed. 4. Romanticization of being understood without words. Movies, books, and social media often glorify the idea of being so emotionally connected that words aren't needed. While this can be beautiful in rare moments, it's not a realistic standard for day-to-day life. Many passive egoists adopt this fantasy as an ideal. They think, if you really loved me, you'd just know. This belief leads to frustration when reality doesn't match the romantic ideal. The desire to be understood without speaking becomes a form of silent emotional demand, one that others don't even know they're failing to meet. 5. Control disguised as modesty. Passive egoism can also stem from a hidden desire to control without appearing controlling. When someone doesn't voice their needs, but gets upset when others don't meet them, they're attempting to steer emotional outcomes indirectly. This gives them a sense of power, without the vulnerability of open dialogue. It sounds like this: I'm not asking for anything, but I expect everything. It feels like humility, but functions like manipulation. It keeps the ego safe while holding others emotionally hostage. 6. Cultural and social influences. In some cultures or family systems, emotional restraint is highly valued. Expressing personal needs may be seen as selfish, dramatic, or disrespectful. People raised in these environments may suppress self-expression as a way to belong or be accepted. They learn to communicate through hints, silence, or passive gestures, expecting others to pick up the message. Over time, this becomes habitual, and they carry this unspoken communication style into all areas of life. 7. Habitual emotional disconnection. Finally, some people simply never learned how to articulate their emotions. They were never taught the language of vulnerability. They don't know how to say, I need help, or I feel hurt, so they default to silence and unspoken expectations. This isn't arrogance, it's emotional illiteracy. Their ego becomes passive not out of pride, but out of emotional confusion and undeveloped communication skills. Passive egoism is not always born from arrogance. More often, it grows out of fear, learned behavior, and unrealistic emotional beliefs. It's a strategy formed in silence to protect the self from hurt. But over time, this protective silence becomes a wall, not just between them and others, but also between their ego and their own true emotional needs. 4. The illusion of being deep or misunderstood expanded. One of the most fascinating and often frustrating aspects of passive egoism is the illusion that being misunderstood is somehow a sign of depth. For many passive egoists, not being easily understood becomes a badge of honor, a symbol of their emotional complexity or intellectual sophistication. But here's the truth: being misunderstood doesn't always mean you're deep. Sometimes it just means you're unclear. This illusion begins when someone believes that their silence or emotional restraint makes them mysterious, insightful, or more emotionally evolved. They think, people don't get me because I think on a different level. I'm not like everyone else. I feel things more deeply. If I have to explain myself, then it's not real understanding. This mindset may sound poetic, but in practice, it becomes a barrier to genuine connection. Others aren't failing to understand because they're shallow or insensitive. They're failing to understand because the passive egoist never gave them anything real to understand in the first place. The mystery that masks avoidance. In many cases, this illusion of depth is actually a defense mechanism, an emotional shield that protects against intimacy. If you convince yourself that you're too deep to be understood, then you never have to take the risk of truly opening up. You never have to explain your feelings, because you've already decided no one could grasp them anyway. This emotional distance isn't strength. It's avoidance. And while it may look calm and composed on the surface, it often hides anxiety, fear, or a fragile sense of self-worth beneath. The emotional consequences of staying unreachable. Over time, this illusion leads to loneliness, not because others don't care, but because they're kept at arm's length by design. The passive egoist might begin to feel invisible or underappreciated, believing, "No one ever really sees me." But the reality is, how can people see you if you never let them in? How can they hear you if your voice is always filtered through silence, hints, or emotional withdrawal? This emotional pattern creates a toxic cycle. 1. The passive egoist withholds communication. 2. Others fail to meet unspoken needs. 3. The passive egoist feels misunderstood and grows resentful. 4. The resentment reinforces their belief that no one truly understands them. 5. So they retreat further into silence. And round it goes. When silence feels like superiority. In some cases, passive egoism also involves a subtle sense of superiority. The person may view themselves as more emotionally intelligent or morally refined because they don't burden others with their feelings. They believe, "Unlike others, I don't demand. I wait. I endure. I suffer in silence." This might seem like self-control, but when it comes with an expectation of being admired, appreciated, or automatically understood, it becomes a silent form of ego elevation. They may start to feel morally superior to those who speak up, cry, or express their frustrations. Yet, ironically, they still want the same emotional rewards, just without the discomfort of asking. The truth about depth. Real depth isn't measured by how hidden you are, it's measured by how willing you are to share your true self. Being deep isn't about being unreadable, it's about being real. It's about facing the discomfort of saying, "Here's who I am, here's what I need," and risking being seen without the mask. Genuine emotional depth requires transparency, humility, and the courage to connect, even when it's messy, even when it's imperfect. So the next time someone believes their silence is a sign of wisdom, remind them gently. Sometimes silence isn't depth, it's distance. And understanding requires more than guessing. It requires words, presence, and emotional honesty. In summary, the illusion of being too deep to be understood is one of the most subtle traps of passive egoism. It feels like strength, but it creates loneliness. It feels like self-respect, but often hides fear. And in the end, it replaces authentic connection with poetic suffering. If we want to be truly known, we must first be willing to be heard, clearly, honestly, and without fear. 5. The silent manipulation, expanded. At first glance, passive egoism appears harmless, even noble. It wears the mask of self-restraint, emotional maturity, or quiet dignity. But behind that stillness, there can be a subtle, unspoken form of manipulation. Not the loud, aggressive kind, but the soft, guilt-inducing kind, the kind that's hard to detect, but deeply felt by those on the receiving end. This is what we call silent manipulation. It happens when someone doesn't clearly express their feelings, yet expects others to respond, adjust, or even apologize as if they had. It's a game of emotional signals without a scoreboard, and often, without consent. Let's explore how this dynamic works and how it quietly drains energy from any relationship. The unspoken punishment system. Passive egoists often use silence as a tool to express displeasure. They won't say what upset them, but their energy shifts, coldness, distance, or withdrawal becomes the message. They might stop replying to messages, avoid eye contact, give one-word answers, or act like everything is fine, when clearly it's not. This behavior creates confusion. The people around them sense that something is wrong, but aren't told what. They're emotionally punished without ever knowing the crime. This turns everyday interactions into emotional landmines. And the worst part? The silent egoist often believes they are being mature by not causing drama. Withholding as a form of control. Another form of silent manipulation is withholding affection, approval, or connection to signal dissatisfaction. For example, a partner may withhold intimacy after a disagreement, without talking about the issue. A friend might ignore messages for days, without saying why. A team member might withdraw participation at work, hoping others notice and cater to their mood. The unspoken message is, until you figure out what's wrong and fix it, I won't fully engage with you. This creates a power imbalance, where others must guess, chase, and accommodate, just to restore peace. Emotional guilt tripping without words. Silent manipulation also includes nonverbal guilt tripping. Sighs, long pauses, sad eyes, or exaggerated emotional distance are used to elicit guilt and make others feel responsible for the passive egoist's emotional state. But here's the trap. Because nothing is said directly, there's no way to resolve the issue. It becomes a cycle of guilt without closure. The person on the receiving end often thinks, what did I miss? What am I supposed to do? How can I fix something they won't even name? This emotional ambiguity is draining and deeply unfair. The illusion of being easy to be around. Many passive egoists see themselves as low maintenance. They'll say things like, I'm not demanding. I don't ask for much. But that's not always the full story. They do ask for understanding, attention, care, but they do it silently, and then feel neglected when their needs aren't met. This creates a false image, someone who seems easygoing, but quietly expects the world to adapt to their unsaid expectations. Over time, this contradiction becomes emotionally manipulative, not because of bad intentions, but because of unacknowledged ego. Emotional power without responsibility. Silent manipulation allows a person to influence others emotionally without taking responsibility for their own needs or emotions. They avoid direct communication, but still expect results. They don't express anger, but expect apologies. They don't ask for comfort, but expect to be comforted. This lets them maintain the upper hand emotionally, always looking calm on the outside, but pulling emotional strings behind the curtain. It's like being the director of a play while pretending to be an audience member. Why this is so damaging. Silent manipulation wears people down. It builds frustration and emotional confusion. Over time, others may feel like they're constantly wrong, always guessing, and never enough. It creates emotional instability in relationships where honesty and clarity are needed most. It also isolates the passive egoists themselves. Because their needs are never spoken clearly, they are rarely met fully. This leads them to feel even more misunderstood, further reinforcing the very behavior that caused the disconnect. In summary, silent manipulation is not about shouting or threatening. It's about using emotional silence to gain influence, sympathy, or control. It's not always intentional, but even when unconscious, it creates emotional harm. True maturity isn't staying silent to look composed. It's speaking honestly, even when it's hard, because connection can't grow in the shadows. It needs light. 6. How to recognize passive egoism in yourself. Expanded. Passive egoism is tricky because it doesn't always feel like ego. Unlike loud arrogance or obvious self-centeredness, passive egoism can feel like emotional maturity, like you're simply being patient, quiet, or restrained. But beneath that calm surface, there may be a silent expectation that others will understand you, support you, or meet your emotional needs, without you ever asking them to. So, how can you tell if you're unknowingly caught in the trap of passive egoism? Let's explore the signs, not to blame yourself, but to begin a path of honest self-awareness and emotional growth. 1. You often feel misunderstood, but you rarely explain yourself. Do you frequently feel like people don't get you? Do you feel emotionally unseen, yet can't remember the last time you clearly expressed how you felt? Passive egoists often experience frustration or disappointment when others don't intuitively understand their emotions. But the truth is, others can't understand what hasn't been shared. If you find yourself thinking things like, if they really cared, they would just know. You may be relying on silent expectations rather than open communication. 2. You avoid expressing needs, but still expect others to meet them. You may believe you're being selfless by not asking for things, whether it's help, comfort, or attention. But deep down, are you hoping someone will notice your silence and step in? This is a core sign of passive egoism, withholding your needs, but feeling hurt when they're not met. This behavior can leave others confused, while you carry silent disappointment. And often, both sides walk away feeling emotionally unfulfilled. 3. You feel hurt when people don't pick up on your mood. Maybe you're upset, but instead of saying so, you withdraw.
You sigh. You go quiet.
You distance yourself emotionally. And then, when no one asks what's wrong or offers comfort, you feel even worse. If this emotional cycle feels familiar, you may be using nonverbal cues as a way to ask for care, without actually asking. This creates an emotional disconnect and places others in a no-win situation. They can't help you if they don't know what's going on. 4. You equate speaking up with being needy or weak. One of the most subtle signs of passive egoism is believing that emotional expression is selfish or shameful. You might think, I don't want to burden anyone. I'll just deal with it on my own. If I ask for something, it means I'm not strong. But here's the truth. Vulnerability is not weakness. It's honesty. Avoiding your own needs while expecting others to sense them anyway is not strength. It's avoidance. And it's a sign your ego is protecting itself by staying hidden. 5. You feel like you're always giving, but rarely receiving. Do you often go out of your way for others, supporting, listening, giving time or gifts, but feel unappreciated in return? This may be a sign that you're using kindness as a silent currency for love, validation, or attention. You may not be giving freely, you're giving quietly with expectations. And when those expectations aren't met, you feel unseen or betrayed. This form of passive egoism often leads to emotional burnout and resentment, because giving without boundaries or clear communication invites misunderstanding. 6. You have trouble saying what you want, but strong reactions when it's ignored. Let's say you want to be invited somewhere or want help with something, but you don't say anything. Then, when no one offers, you feel angry or sad. You might think, if I have to ask, it doesn't count. This belief turns basic human needs into secret emotional tests. And when others fail those tests, even though they never knew they were being tested, relationships begin to suffer. You feel neglected. Others feel unfairly blamed. And the ego, again, remains in control without ever showing its face. 7. You pride yourself on being low maintenance, but still crave emotional validation. Passive egoists often see themselves as the easy ones, the ones who don't need much, who stay out of drama, who never demand anything. But internally, they may feel hurt when others don't go out of their way to notice or care for them. If you catch yourself thinking things like, I never ask for anything, the least they could do is check on me, then you're not as low maintenance as you believe. You just communicate your needs silently and expect others to listen without being told. Recognizing passive egoism in yourself doesn't mean you're selfish, manipulative, or emotionally broken. It means you've developed habits, often from childhood or past trauma, that prioritize emotional safety over honest communication. But growth begins with awareness. By identifying these patterns, you give yourself the opportunity to break them. You give yourself permission to speak, to ask, to feel, without shame and without fear. Because in truth, the most mature and self-aware thing you can do isn't to stay silent. It's to be clear, kind, and honest about who you are and what you need. 7. Healing the passive ego, expanded. Healing passive egoism is not about becoming louder, more aggressive, or suddenly demanding attention. It's not about swinging from silence to dominance. Instead, it's about learning how to express your inner world with honesty, clarity, and compassion for yourself and others. Passive egoism grows in silence. It thrives in unspoken expectations and emotional hiding. So the path to healing begins with one powerful decision: the willingness to be seen. Let's walk through what it truly means to heal this quiet form of ego. 1. Choose conscious communication over assumed understanding. The first step in healing passive egoism is to recognize that others can't understand what you never share. No matter how intuitive someone may be, They are not living inside your mind. You must replace silent expectation with clear expression. Start by using simple, direct language. I feel overwhelmed today. I'd really appreciate a hug right now. Can we talk? Something's been on my mind. This might feel awkward at first. You might feel exposed. But this is where the healing begins. Speaking your truth isn't a weakness. It's a bridge to connection. 2. Acknowledge that needs are not a burden. One of the reasons people fall into passive egoism is the belief that expressing needs makes them too much. But in reality, everyone has needs. Emotional, physical, psychological. They don't make you needy, they make you human. Repeat this to yourself if needed. My needs are valid. My voice deserves space. You are not a burden for wanting to be heard, supported, or loved. You only become a burden when you expect others to meet needs that you've never clearly expressed. 3. Practice vulnerability, even when it feels risky. Passive ego often hides behind the illusion of control. By staying silent, you avoid rejection, disappointment, or judgment. But in doing so, you also avoid real connection. Healing begins when you start to let others in, even when it's uncomfortable. Try saying things like, "This is hard for me to talk about, but I don't know how to say this perfectly, but I want to try." These small acts of vulnerability are acts of emotional courage. And over time, they rewire the belief that silence is safer than truth. 4. Release the fantasy of being perfectly understood without words. As comforting as it may seem, the idea that someone should just know how you feel is a fantasy. It creates invisible emotional tests that others can't pass because they never knew they were being tested. Let it go. Let go of the myth that real love doesn't require communication. Let go of the dream that understanding should happen automatically. Real relationships are built, not guessed. They are created through shared truths, not silent assumptions. 5. Embrace emotional literacy. Sometimes, passive egoism develops simply because we don't have the language to express how we feel. So part of healing is learning how to name your emotions. Instead of vague responses like, "I'm fine," or "nothing's wrong," learn to say, "I feel ignored. I feel anxious and unsure of myself. I'm feeling a little jealous and I don't know why." When you can name your feelings, you take ownership of them. And when you own your feelings, you no longer need to manipulate others into guessing them. 6. Create safe spaces for expression. Healing takes time. You may not feel comfortable speaking up in every situation right away. That's okay. Start small. Journal your thoughts. Open up to a trusted friend or therapist. Practice having one honest conversation each week. Build emotional momentum by creating safe, low-pressure spaces where your voice can grow. You don't need to leap. Just step forward. 7. Replace guilt with gratitude. When someone finally understands your needs because you express them, don't feel guilty. Don't say, "Sorry I asked." Instead, say, "Thank you for listening." Gratitude strengthens connection. It replaces shame with warmth. It reminds you and the other person that open communication is not a disruption. It's a gift. 8. Forgive your past silence. Maybe you spent years staying quiet. Maybe you let people walk over you because you didn't speak up. Maybe you hurt people by expecting too much without ever saying a word. Forgive yourself. You did what you knew how to do. You were protecting yourself. But now you know better. Now you have a choice. Not to become someone else, but to become yourself with a voice. In summary, healing the passive ego is about unlearning the belief that silence equals strength. It's about understanding that your emotions don't have to be hidden to be respected. And most of all, it's about recognizing that real connection only happens when you allow yourself to be truly seen and truly heard. You don't have to scream. You don't have to demand.
But you do have to speak.
8. How to deal with someone who has passive egoism expanded. Recognizing passive egoism in others can be just as important as recognizing it in ourselves, especially if we care deeply about the person. You might love someone who rarely says how they feel, yet constantly wants to be understood. You may work with someone who never asks for help, but becomes frustrated when support doesn't appear. Or maybe you're close to a friend or partner who goes quiet during conflict, but then expects reconciliation without ever having a real conversation. So how do you deal with passive egoism in someone you care about without falling into the trap of constant emotional guesswork? Let's explore the key steps to creating a relationship built on clarity, compassion, and boundaries. 1. Be patient, but don't be a mind reader. The most important first step is patience. Passive egoism is often rooted in emotional fear or past wounds. So your response must be gentle, not forceful. But patience doesn't mean putting up with confusion forever. Let them know, kindly but clearly, that you're willing to listen, but you need words, not silence. Say things like, "I care about how you feel, but I need you to help me understand. I don't want to guess. I want to hear it from you." This sets a healthy tone, supportive but honest. It encourages them to speak, without enabling their silence. 2. Don't play emotional detective. One of the biggest traps people fall into when dealing with a passive egoist is trying to read every mood, decode every silence, and interpret every sigh. This turns into emotional detective work that's exhausting and unrewarding. Stop. You're not responsible for figuring out how someone feels when they refuse to tell you. Instead, create space by saying, "You seem off today. If you want to talk, I'm here." And then let it go.
Don't push. Don't chase.
Let them choose openness, and don't carry the emotional weight they won't share. 3. Encourage directness with safety, not pressure. Passive egoists often stay silent because they fear their truth will be rejected. So when they finally start to open up, even a little, don't interrupt, criticize, or rush them. Just listen. Even if what they say comes out clumsily or defensively, treat it as a step in the right direction. Respond with words like, "Thank you for telling me. I appreciate your honesty." These simple affirmations make them feel emotionally safer, and safety is the soil where honesty can grow. 4. Set boundaries around emotional withholding. While compassion is key, boundaries are just as important. It's not healthy for you to constantly feel confused, blamed, or responsible for emotions that were never spoken aloud. You have the right to say, "I can't keep guessing what's wrong. I need clarity so we can work through this. I want this relationship to feel mutual." That means we both share honestly. If someone continues to use silence or withdrawal as a tool, make it clear that this dynamic can't continue, not out of anger, but out of respect for your emotional well-being. 5. Don't reward silent manipulation. When someone withdraws affection, love, or attention as a way to signal their disappointment, don't rush to fix it, especially if they won't talk about it. If you always step in to make things better, they'll never learn to communicate directly. Let silence be their choice, but don't let it be your responsibility. If they want to reconnect, they'll need to bring words, not just moods. That's how emotional equality is built. 6. Recognize the limits of what you can do. Sometimes, no matter how much you listen, encourage, or support, the person won't change. They might stay locked in patterns of silence, self-pity, or subtle manipulation. If that happens, remind yourself of this truth. You can't heal someone who refuses to meet you halfway. You can love them, but you cannot communicate for them. You can invite them to open up, but you cannot force clarity out of silence. If the emotional toll becomes too heavy, it's okay to step back or even walk away. That's not cruelty. That's self-respect. 7. Celebrate small wins. If someone you care about makes even a small effort to speak up, acknowledge it. Healing takes time. Maybe they express their feelings imperfectly. Maybe they stumble. Maybe they overshare or undershare. That's okay. What matters is the direction, not perfection. Say things like, "I noticed you opened up more. That meant a lot. Thanks for trusting me with that." These moments plant seeds. Over time, they grow into deeper emotional trust and a more balanced relationship. In summary, dealing with someone who has passive egoism requires a blend of compassion and boundaries. You must support them in becoming more honest, without sacrificing your own clarity and peace in the process. You don't have to fix them. You don't have to carry what they won't express. But you can be the person who invites truth, gently, consistently, and with care. Because in the end, real connection doesn't happen in silence. It happens in truth. Conclusion: the power of speaking up. Passive egoism may look calm, but it often hides frustration, fear, and a deep desire to be seen. True understanding isn't a guessing game. It's built through courageous honesty and shared vulnerability. Speaking your truth isn't selfish. It's a gift to both yourself and others. And in that clarity, ego no longer needs to hide. Ego Pedia, helping you decode the quiet power plays of the mind. Let your silence be peaceful, not manipulative. Let your voice be a bridge, not a wall.